Hey everyone, welcome to the show. I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in data. Numbers, stats, reports everywhere you look. It can get overwhelming.
Yeah, it really can. It's everywhere.
But what if instead of feeling swamped, we could actually use all this data to make smarter choices? What if it could help us actually understand things better?
Right.
Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today with the book Analytics the Right Way by Tim Wilson and Joe Sutherland.
It's a really fantastic book.
Yeah. It's like having a guide, right?
Yeah.
Like a guide through the sea of data, helping us find those hidden treasures of insight.
It's about moving from that feeling of data overload to actually feeling empowered by the data.
Ooh, I like that data empowerment. So let's talk about it. This book starts off by busting some common myths about data, and I think that's a really powerful place to begin.
Yeah, I agree. We got to make sure we're all on the same page about what data actually is and what it isn't.
Right. So what are some of these misconceptions that people often have about data?
Well, one of the biggest ones is the idea that more data automatically means less uncertainty.
Yeah, we all think if I just get enough information, I can eliminate all risk.
Right, exactly. Like if we just have all the data, we'll have all the answers. But the book uses a simple coin flip example that really challenges this.
Yeah, I remember that example. It really made me think.
It's pretty powerful.
Can you kind of walk us through it again?
Okay, so imagine you're flipping a coin. You can collect mountains of data about every single aspect of that flip, the force you used, the angle, the air temperature, anything you can think of. But at the end of the day, it's still a 50-50 chance.
Right. Yeah, it's totally random.
Right. So even with tons of data, some things just remain inherently random. You can't predict the outcome with absolute certainty.
Right. You can't control for everything. You can't know everything.
And the book really encourages us to think critically about, like, in what situations might more data not actually reduce uncertainty?
Oh, that's interesting.
Are there areas in your work where you're collecting data that's not really helping you reduce risk? Could you maybe be focusing on the wrong metrics?
So it really asks us to kind of step back and really analyze what we're doing with our data.
And be more intentional about it.
Right. Exactly.
I like that. Okay, so that's more data doesn't equal less uncertainty. What's another myth the book tackles?
Another big one is this idea that data is always objective.
Oh, yeah, like data is cold, hard facts, right?
Right. But in reality, bias can actually creep in at every stage of the process, from how the data is collected to how it's analyzed and interpreted.
It's like that saying, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
If your data is flawed from the start, your analysis is going to be flawed too.
Exactly. And so the book highlights how important it is to be aware of these potential biases. And then once you're aware of them, you can start to take steps to mitigate them.
Like by asking questions.
Right. Who collected this data? What were their motivations?
Are there any blind spots in our collection methods?
Right. Exactly. We have to be really careful. Okay, so we've got more data doesn't equal less uncertainty, and data isn't always objective. What's the third myth that they debunk?
The third one is this belief that simply giving people access to data magically makes an organization data-driven.
Yeah, it's like handing someone a sports car without teaching them how to drive, right?
Yeah.
They might have a powerful tool, but if they don't know how to use it, they're going to cause more harm than good.
Exactly. You can give people all the data in the world, but if they don't have the skills and the mindset to actually interpret it, to draw meaningful insights, and then to use those insights to actually make informed decisions, then it's all kind of useless.
You need data literacy.
Yes, exactly. You need the knowledge and the skills to know what to do with it.
So that's where the book's framework for data usage comes in. And they actually outline 3 powerful ways to apply data, each with its own purpose and its own approach.
Yeah, it's a really practical framework that you can actually start using today.
Yeah, so tell me about those 3 uses. I'm intrigued.
Okay, so the first one is performance measurement. Think of it as your business GPS, right? It tells you, are you on track? Are you ahead? Are you falling behind expectations? It's all about setting clear goals and then using data to track your progress towards those goals.
So instead of just flying blind, you're actually using the data to guide your decisions and make sure you're actually headed in the right direction.
Right, exactly. And the book actually emphasizes the importance of setting those goals up front, even before you start. They actually call it the performance measurement time machine. Imagine going back in time to establish those clear expectations before you even begin a project. It can help you avoid vague targets or constantly shifting goalposts.
That is a fantastic analogy. I love that the performance measurement time machine It's like creating a roadmap, right?
Yeah,
A roadmap for success.
exactly.
And then you can use the data to navigate your journey.
And it's not just about tracking whether you're hitting your targets. It's also about understanding the difference between outputs and outcomes.
Okay, explain that one to me.
So outputs are the things that you produce, like website traffic or social media engagement.
I see. Okay.
But outcomes are the results that you achieve. So things like increased sales or improved customer satisfaction.
So you're not just busy, you're effective.
Yeah.
You're actually making a difference.
Right, exactly. You could have a ton of website traffic, which is great. That's an output. But if it's not translating into actual conversions or sales, then you're not really achieving your goals.
The outcome is what we really want.
Exactly. And performance measurement helps you connect those dots and make sure you're focused on the metrics that really matter.
It's about being intentional.
Yes.
What gets measured gets managed. Okay, so that's performance measurement. As the first use of data, what's the second one?
The second one is hypothesis validation.
Oh, okay.
And the basic idea is that not all ideas are worth pursuing, so how can you test your assumptions before investing a ton of time and resources?
Yeah, I think a lot of us struggle with that, right? Because we have these hunches, we have gut feelings. But how do we move from intuition to evidence-based decision-making?
Right, exactly. And the book suggests starting with 2 magic questions.
Okay, what are they? I like magic questions.
The first question is, what are we actually trying to achieve? And this forces you to articulate that specific goal or the outcome that you're aiming for. And the second question is, how will we know if we've actually achieved it?
Okay.
And that's where you define those metrics that will tell you if you're successful.
So it's like setting a clear destination and then identifying the landmarks that will tell you if you're on the right path.
Yes, exactly. And it's not just about picking any random metric. The book really encourages you to choose metrics that are truly meaningful and relevant to your overall goals.
So we're being very intentional about which metrics we choose.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm really curious about how we actually put hypothesis validation into practice.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. You know, we all have those beliefs and ideas that we kind of take for granted, but how do we actually challenge those assumptions and test them rigorously?
Yeah, it's easy to get stuck in our own heads and just assume we're right.
Exactly. And that's where the book's framework for different levels of evidence comes in. And they outline 3 main types: anecdotal, descriptive, and scientific.
Ooh, okay. That sounds like a solid approach. Let's break those down one by one. What exactly is anecdotal evidence?
Sure. Well, think of it as those personal stories or observations that we often rely on.
Oh yeah, like your friend who swears by a certain diet because they lost a ton of weight, or a colleague who claims that a particular sales technique always works for them.
Exactly. We all have those anecdotal experiences that shape our beliefs, but the book really cautions against relying on them too heavily.
Makes sense. Why is that?
Yeah.
I mean, those stories can be pretty compelling.
Right, they can be. But the thing is, anecdotal evidence is inherently subjective, right? And it's often based on a very limited sample size. So it's easy to cherry pick stories that confirm our existing beliefs, but that doesn't necessarily mean those anecdotes represent a broader truth.
So it's like seeing a pattern where there isn't one, just because a few data points happen to align with what we already think.
Exactly. And that's a trap we all fall into sometimes. You know, we see what we want to see.
Totally. So while anecdotal evidence can be a good starting point for generating ideas, it's not a solid foundation for making important decisions.
Right. You wouldn't base a major business strategy or a medical treatment plan solely on a handful of anecdotes, would you?
Definitely not. You'd want something a little more rigorous.
Exactly. And that brings us to the next level of evidence: descriptive evidence.
Okay, let's dive into that. How is that different from anecdotal?
Well, descriptive evidence involves actually analyzing existing data to uncover patterns and trends. So think of things like looking at sales figures over time, or studying customer demographics, or tracking website traffic patterns.
So instead of relying on individual stories, you're actually looking at the bigger picture, the aggregated data, to try to identify broader patterns.
Right. And descriptive evidence can be incredibly valuable for understanding your business or your audience. But the book emphasizes that correlation doesn't equal causation.
Oh, that's a classic one. Just because two things happen together doesn't mean one caused the other. There could be all sorts of other factors at play.
Exactly. And the book gives an example of a company that noticed an increase in both social media engagement and product orders. So initially, they just assumed that their social media efforts were driving those sales. But when they dug deeper, they realized that both trends were simply reflecting a seasonal upswing in demand.
So they were mistakenly attributing the sales increase to their social media campaign when it was actually driven by something else entirely.
Right. And this is where the concept of confounding bias comes in. It's about being aware of those hidden variables that can distort our understanding of cause and effect.
Those sneaky variables lurking in the shadows. So how do we avoid falling into that trap?
Well, the book mentions a technique called first differences that can help address this issue.
Okay, can you explain that a bit more? First differences. It sounds intriguing.
Sure. So, first differences is a statistical method that helps you isolate the true impact of a variable by accounting for changes over time. So, imagine you're tracking website traffic and you introduce a new marketing campaign. First differences would help you separate the impact of that campaign from any underlying trends in traffic that were already happening.
Ah, so it's like removing the background noise so you can clearly see the signal of your intervention.
Exactly. And techniques like first differences are essential for avoiding those misleading correlations that can lead to bad decisions.
So we've got anecdotal evidence, which is based on personal stories, and descriptive evidence, which analyzes existing data to reveal patterns. What about the third level scientific evidence?
Right. So scientific evidence comes from controlled experiments where you actually manipulate variables to isolate cause and effect.
Okay, so that's where things get really rigorous.
Right. Yes. Think of A/B testing, where you show two different versions of a web page to different groups of users to see which one performs better. Or clinical trials in medicine, where participants are randomly assigned to receive either a drug or a placebo.
So it's about creating that controlled environment where you can minimize those external factors and really zero in on the impact of a specific variable.
Exactly. And scientific evidence is generally considered the most robust type of evidence because it allows for greater certainty about cause and effect.
But the book also acknowledges that controlled experiments aren't always feasible or ethical.
Right. They can be expensive and time-consuming to conduct, and they're not always appropriate for every situation. Sometimes you might have to rely on descriptive evidence or even anecdotal evidence if those are the only options available.
So it's about choosing the right tool for the job, the right level of evidence based on your specific hypothesis, the resources you have available, and the stakes involved.
Right. And even with scientific evidence, it's crucial to remember that we never achieve 100% certainty. There's always a margin of error and the possibility of unknown factors influencing our results.
That's where things like confidence intervals come in, right? Acknowledging that range of uncertainty in our findings.
Yes, exactly. It's about being transparent about the limitations of our data and avoiding overstating our conclusions. Data analysis is about making more informed decisions, not about claiming absolute truth.
That humility is so important. It seems like hypothesis validation is all about being a data detective, carefully gathering evidence, considering alternative explanations, and really trying to avoid those cognitive biases that can lead us astray.
That's a great way to put it. And that detective mindset is crucial, whether you're analyzing data for a major corporation or just making decisions in your own life.
So true. Now, before we move on, I wanted to touch on something you mentioned earlier, the importance of choosing the right unit of analysis. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. So the unit of analysis refers to the level at which you're collecting and analyzing your data. For example, if you're studying customer satisfaction, your unit of analysis could be individual customers. Or it could be groups of customers, like segments based on demographics or purchase history.
So it's about defining who or what you're studying and making sure that your data actually aligns with that level of analysis.
Exactly. And this is where things can get tricky. The book warns against what's called aggregation bias, which is essentially drawing conclusions about individuals based on data that's been aggregated at a higher level.
Ooh, can you give an example of that?
Yeah, imagine a company analyzing employee satisfaction and finding that, on average, employees are happy with their salaries. But if they actually dig deeper and look at the data by department, they might find that, say, engineers are very dissatisfied with their pay, while the marketing team is very satisfied.
Ah, so the aggregate data is masking those important variations within different subgroups. That's why it's so important to choose the right unit of analysis and avoid making sweeping generalizations based on aggregated data.
Precisely. And this is a really common pitfall in data analysis. We need to be mindful of the level at which we're collecting and analyzing data and avoid jumping to conclusions that aren't supported by the evidence.
It seems like every step of this hypothesis validation involves careful consideration, critical thinking. From defining the hypothesis to choosing the right evidence and then analyzing it correctly. It's definitely not as simple as just crunching numbers and spitting out results.
You're absolutely right. Analytics the right way really emphasizes that data analysis is a process, not a magic bullet. It requires a combination of technical skills, domain expertise, and a healthy dose of skepticism.
Well said. So I think we've explored hypothesis validation in good depth. Are we ready to move on to the third and final use of data operational enablement?
Absolutely. That's where we really see how these data insights can be translated into real-world actions and tangible results.
So how about we take a quick break and then come back to unravel the fascinating world of operational enablement and discover how data can truly transform a business or organization.
Sounds good to me. Welcome back, everyone. So last time we started exploring those three key uses of data from analytics the right way, and we talked about those data myths.
Right. We learned that more data doesn't always equal less uncertainty,
Mm.
and that just having access to data doesn't make you data-driven, right? It's
Right.
about using the right data the right way,
Exactly.
which brings us to those three key uses.
Yeah. And we started talking about performance measurement,
Right.
which is like using data as our GPS to track progress toward our goals.
Right.
But now let's dive into the second use,
Right.
hypothesis validation.
Okay, yes. So we talked about those two magic questions.
Hmm.
What are you trying to achieve, and how will you know if you've achieved it? But once you've defined your goal and your metrics, how do you actually go about testing that hypothesis? How do we actually know if our hunch is right?
Right. Yeah. That's where those different levels of evidence come in.
Okay.
The book outlines three main types:
Okay.
anecdotal, descriptive, and scientific.
Ooh, okay, so a range of evidence types.
Yeah. Each has its strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one.
Okay.
What exactly is anecdotal evidence?
So think of it as those personal stories or observations we often rely on. Like your friend who swears by a certain diet because they lost weight, or your colleague who claims that this particular sales technique always works for them.
Right, we all have those friends. We all have those experiences.
Exactly. We all have those anecdotal experiences that shape our beliefs, but the book really cautions against relying on them too heavily.
Because they're not always reliable.
Right. Anecdotal evidence is inherently subjective, and it's often based on a very limited sample size, right? So it's really easy to cherry pick stories that just confirm our existing beliefs. But that doesn't mean those anecdotes represent a broader truth.
So you're saying it's important to be really careful about anecdotal evidence
Right.
and not just assume that it always applies to everyone.
Exactly.
Okay, so while those anecdotes can be a good starting point for generating ideas, it's not a very solid foundation for making important decisions.
Exactly. You wouldn't base a major business strategy on just one or two anecdotes, would you?
No, definitely not. I need more than that. Okay, so that brings us to descriptive evidence.
Right.
How is that different from anecdotal?
So descriptive evidence involves actually analyzing existing data to uncover patterns and trends. Think of things like looking at sales figures over time, or studying customer demographics, or tracking website traffic patterns. It's really about using data visualization tools and basic statistical analysis to kind of paint a clearer picture of what's happening.
So instead of relying on just those individual stories, you're looking at that bigger picture, the aggregated data,
Right.
to try to identify those broader patterns.
Exactly, yeah. And descriptive evidence can be really valuable for understanding your business or understanding your audience. But again, the book emphasizes that correlation doesn't equal causation.
Oh, that's an important point. Just because two things happen together doesn't mean one caused the other.
Right. The book gives an example of a company that noticed an increase in both social media engagement and product orders.
Yeah, okay.
And initially, they just assumed their social media efforts were driving sales.
Right, makes sense.
But when they dug deeper, they realized both trends were simply reflecting a seasonal upswing in demand.
Oh, so they were just misinterpreting the data.
Exactly. They were mistakenly attributing the sales increase to their social media campaign when it was actually driven by something else entirely. And this is where that confounding bias comes in, right? We have to be aware of those hidden variables that can really distort our understanding of cause and effect.
Those sneaky variables, yeah. So how do we actually avoid falling into that trap? How do we tease apart those variables?
Well, the book mentions a really interesting technique called first differences.
Okay, first differences. What is that?
So, first differences is a statistical method that helps you isolate the true impact of a variable by accounting for those changes over time. Imagine you're tracking website traffic, right?
Okay.
And you introduce a new marketing campaign. First differences would help you actually separate the impact of that campaign from any underlying trends in traffic that were already occurring.
So it's like you're removing that background noise.
Exactly.
So you can clearly see the signal of your intervention. Like you're saying,
Yeah.
how much did the marketing campaign actually
Right.
impact the traffic?
Exactly.
Okay, interesting.
And techniques like first differences are essential for avoiding those misleading correlations that lead to bad decisions.
Okay, so we've got anecdotal evidence, which is based on personal stories, and we've got descriptive evidence, which analyzes existing data to reveal patterns. What about the third level? Scientific evidence. How does that play into this?
So scientific evidence comes from controlled experiments,
Okay.
where you actually manipulate variables to try to isolate cause and effect. Think of things like A/B testing, right? Where you show two different versions of a web page to different groups of users and see which one performs better. Or clinical trials in medicine, where you have participants randomly assigned to receive either the drug or a placebo.
So you're really creating that controlled environment, right? Minimizing those external factors.
Exactly. And scientific evidence is generally considered the most robust type of evidence because it really allows for greater certainty about cause and effect.
But the book also acknowledges that those controlled experiments aren't always possible, or
Right.
they're not always ethical.
Right. Exactly. They can be expensive and time-consuming to conduct, and they're not always appropriate for every situation. Sometimes you might have to rely on descriptive evidence or even anecdotal evidence.
If that's all you've got.
Right, exactly. If those are the only options available.
Okay.
So it's about choosing the right level of evidence based on your specific hypothesis, the resources that you have, and the stakes involved.
Right. You have to weigh those trade-offs.
And even with scientific evidence, it's crucial to remember we never achieve 100% certainty.
Right. There's always that margin of error.
There's always a margin of error and the possibility of unknown factors influencing our results.
That's where those confidence intervals come in, right?
Right.
Acknowledging that range of uncertainty in our findings.
It's really about being transparent about the limitations of our data and avoiding overstating our conclusions. Data analysis is about making more informed decisions. It's not about claiming absolute truth.
Right. It's about getting closer to the truth, recognizing that we may never fully get there. But that's okay. And that humility is so important, right? It seems like this whole hypothesis validation process is all about being a data detective,
Yeah.
carefully gathering evidence, considering alternative explanations, and really trying to avoid those cognitive biases that can lead us astray.
That's a great way to put it. And that detective mindset is crucial, whether you're analyzing data for a major corporation or just making decisions in your own life.
Okay, so before we move on, I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned earlier.
Okay.
The importance of choosing the right unit of analysis.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? What does that actually mean?
Sure. So the unit of analysis refers to the level at which you're collecting and analyzing your data. For example, if you're studying customer satisfaction, your unit of analysis could be individual customers, or it could be groups of customers, like segments based on demographics or purchase history.
So it's about defining who or what you're studying
Right.
and making sure that your data aligns with that level of analysis.
Exactly. And this is where things can get a little tricky. The book warns against something called aggregation bias,
Aggregation bias, okay.
which is essentially drawing conclusions about individuals based on data that's been aggregated at a higher level.
Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, so imagine a company analyzing employee satisfaction, and they're looking at it and they find that on average, employees are happy with their salaries.
Okay.
But if they actually dig deeper and look at the data by department, they might find that, say, the engineers are very dissatisfied with their pay, while the marketing team is very satisfied.
So the aggregate data is masking those important variations
Right.
within those different subgroups. So that's why it's so important to choose that right unit of analysis and avoid making those sweeping generalizations based on aggregated data.
Exactly. And that's a really common pitfall. We need to be mindful of the level at which we're collecting and analyzing data and avoid jumping to conclusions that aren't supported by the evidence.
It seems like this whole hypothesis validation process, every step involves really careful consideration and critical thinking. From defining your hypothesis, choosing the right type of evidence, and then actually analyzing it correctly. It's not as simple as just crunching numbers and spitting out results.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Analytics the right way really emphasizes that data analysis is a process, not a magic bullet. It requires that combination of technical skills, domain expertise, and that healthy dose of skepticism.
Right, and being aware of those biases and those pitfalls that we can fall into.
Exactly.
Okay, so I think we've explored hypothesis validation in depth.
Yeah, I think so too.
Are we ready to move on to that third and final use of data, which is operational enablement?
Absolutely. Let's dive into that and see how we can take all of these data insights and put them into action.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been spending these last two parts exploring the book Analytics the Right Way.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. We've busted some myths about data. We've talked about using data to track performance and even to test our assumptions with different types of evidence. But now we get to the exciting part, actually putting those insights to work.
That's right. This is where operational enablement comes in, taking all those data insights and turning them into real-world processes.
Okay, so remind me again, what does that look like in practice? How do we actually bridge the gap from analysis to action?
Well, the book uses this great analogy of a factory. Raw data comes in, goes through a series of processes, and then emerges as a valuable output.
Okay.
So operational enablement is all about designing those processes to be efficient, effective, and of course, powered by data.
I like that visual, the data factory. So we're designing these data-driven processes, but not all processes are created equal, right?
Exactly.
Some are simple and straightforward.
Yeah.
Others are more complex and involve a lot of human judgment.
Right. The simple ones we can often just automate entirely. Things like sending out email marketing campaigns based on specific customer actions. Or you could have an inventory management system that automatically reorders supplies when stock runs low.
Ooh, like a digital assistant taking care of those repetitive tasks.
Exactly.
So we can free up our human brains for the more strategic work.
Yeah.
But what about those more complex processes? The ones that are less clear-cut and involve more human intuition and context?
Yeah, those are trickier, right? It's harder to define rules when there's so much nuance involved.
It's like trying to teach a robot to write poetry. There's that human element that's hard to replicate.
Right, and that's where things like machine learning and AI come into play.
Ah, yes, the buzzwords of the century. But seriously, how can AI actually help us with this, especially for those really complex scenarios?
Well, machine learning algorithms can analyze huge amounts of data and identify those subtle patterns that humans would probably miss.
Okay.
So it allows us to create systems that are more adaptive and can handle those more nuanced situations.
So instead of a human having to, painstakingly review every single customer interaction, an algorithm can actually learn from thousands of past interactions and then suggest the best course of action in real time.
Exactly. Yeah. Think of chatbots, for example, that get better at understanding and responding to customer inquiries the more people they interact with, or those recommendation engines that tailor suggestions based on your past behavior.
Okay, so it's like having this data-driven intuition engine that's constantly learning and improving.
That's a great way to put it. But the book also emphasizes that we still need human oversight, even with really sophisticated AI.
That makes sense, especially when we're talking about ethics and really complex decision-making. We can't just hand over the reins completely to the algorithms, right?
Exactly. And they talk about human in the loop and human out of the loop processes.
Okay.
In the first one, humans are still involved in overseeing and guiding the automated system and potentially overriding it. And in the second one, the process is fully automated.
So finding that right balance between human and machine is key. Right.
It really is. And the book provides a framework for making those decisions. And it comes down to doing a cost-benefit analysis, really.
Okay.
Automating a process might save you time and resources,
Sure.
but it also requires upfront investment, and you have to maintain it.
And not to mention the risks if something goes wrong.
Right, exactly. So we have to really think about, how complex is the process? What's the potential for errors? What's the impact going to be on our stakeholders?
It's like weighing all those different factors.
Right.
And it probably depends on each organization's culture, too.
Exactly. Yeah. How comfortable they are with using AI. It's not about blindly embracing automation. It's about making those strategic choices.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive into analytics the right way. We've covered so much ground. We started by debunking those myths about data. Then we explored how to use data to track our performance and test our hypotheses. And now we've seen how we can turn those insights into action with operational enablement.
It really gives us a powerful toolkit, this book.
It does. For anyone who wants to move beyond that feeling of data overload and harness the true power of analytics, whether you're running a business or conducting research or just trying to make better decisions in your life, I think this book has something for everyone.
I agree.
If you have a favorite takeaway from the book or even from this episode, be sure to share it in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with anyone who might find it valuable. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep using data to make a positive impact on the world.